In this video, we will look at some concepts related to market equilibrium. As we can see in the graph, this would be the supply curve and this is the demand curve, and this is at equilibrium where the supply curve and demand curve are intersecting. And the price at equilibrium will mark it as PE, and this is the maximum price the consumers are willing to pay, and this will put it as Px, and this is the minimum price that the producers are willing to produce. It would be Py. Now here the first concept is that excess demand. Now when does an excess demand happen? For example, the prices actually at lower than Pe. Let's look at a price here, this price point. The quantity demanded would be greater than the quantity supplied. So there is an excess demand. So this is actually the excess demand. So always excess demand will happen when the price is actually below the equilibrium price. And what would have been the excess supply? Excess supply is where the price is above the equilibrium price. For example, at this price, the producers are willing to supply at this quantity, and the consumers are actually willing to buy at this price point this much of quantity. So as you can see, there is more products has been supplied in the market. At this price point there will be excess supply. Always the excess supply price would be actually above the equilibrium price. These are two concepts that we need to understand. We would also look at concepts such as consumer surplus and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is derived whenever the price a consumer actually pays is less than they are prepared to pay. A demand curve indicates what price consumers are prepared to pay for a hypothetical quantity of a good based on their expectations of private benefit. For example, Px would be the maximum that the consumers are prepared to pay at this demand for this quantity, and but actually they are paying only the equilibrium price. So at some consumers are actually prepared to pay at this quantity, but they'll be paying at the equilibrium price. So anything that is above the equilibrium price, that is known as the consumer surplus. So this area here would be consumer surplus. They are prepared to pay at a higher price, but actually they are paying at equilibrium. So this is the benefit that they are getting. But as you can see, there is a declining consumer surplus in the demand curve. Consumer surplus generally declines with consumption. One way to explain for this is the law of diminishing marginal utility, which suggests that the first unit of a good or service consumed generates much greater utility than the second, which generates greater utility than the third and subsequent units. A very thirsty consumer will be prepared to pay a relatively high price for their first soft drink. But as they drink more, less utility is derived and the price they would be prepared to pay actually falls. As utility falls, the price that consumers are prepared to pay also declines, causing the demand curve to slope down and the consumer surplus also to decline. Now, what is actually a producer surplus? The producers are prepared to pay at this minimum level for this quantity, and at this quantity they are prepared to pay at this price point, but actually they are getting the price at equilibrium. So whatever that is above the minimum price that they are prepared to actually supply for is actually the producer surplus. So producer surplus is the additional private benefit to the producers in terms of profit gained when the price they receive in the market is more than the minimum they would be prepared to supply for. In other words, they received a reward that more than covers their cost of production. Now the other concept here is that economic welfare. Economic welfare is the total benefit available to society from an economic transaction or situation. So economic welfare is also called community surplus, which is made up of the area of consumer surplus plus the area of producer surplus. So in this example here, the economic welfare would be equal to the consumer surplus, this area, plus the producer surplus. Now, another question may be, how do we actually calculate consumer surplus? Consumer surplus can be calculated as the maximum price here, that is Px, minus the equilibrium price, Pe, into the quantity in equilibrium, the equilibrium quantity, QE, divided by 2, which will give this area of consumer surplus. Likewise, the producer surplus can be calculated by equilibrium price minus the minimum price that the producers are willing to supply for, Py, into equilibrium quantity divided by 2. So these are the ways to calculate consumer surplus, producer surplus, and to calculate economic welfare is to add consumer surplus and producer surplus. These actually wrap up the concepts related to market equilibrium.